All right, everyone. Democrats the other day were stomping and hooting and jumping around with celebratory and misplaced glee because they don't understand anything about poll analysis. And this is something that Republicans do too. Pretty much everyone that has a political opinion wants polls that show good news for their candidate or their idea. They want those to be the real numbers, and so they're willing to use their cognitive dissonance to ignore actual aggregates or to ignore any polls that run counter to their narrative. I'm going to be looking at this because there was a CNN poll the other day that was released, and it showed Joe Biden 14 points ahead of Donald Trump. And, all of these people on the left are like, well, he's really done it this time. Trump has lost already, like it was November, or like one poll mattered. The aggregate actually shows an 8-point gap. That is, it's just as likely that Biden's only 3 points ahead, or 4 points ahead. By the way, that would be easily surmounted because Trump has legendary amounts of in-party approval. There's a huge enthusiasm gap. It's certainly larger than it was in 2016 by a considerable margin, I think 5 points. And remember, he won against Hillary Clinton, so keep that in mind. You haven't had the debates yet, and I'm hazarding a guess, and it's not certain because the debates haven't happened yet. Never count the chickens before they hatch. I have the feeling that Trump is going to dominate the debates, assuming that they actually happen. And if they don't, it'll be because Biden has decided to essentially be a coward, and that would look bad for him, and I don't think that there's any real way optically to pitch that. Digital-only debates probably would have the same trajectory. Trump wins, but less impact. But let's look at the actual numbers here. You remember in 2012, in that election, when Karl Rove cherry-picked his data, and he actually believed his own bullshit, and so on election night when Obama won, he expected Romney to win like 3 or 4 different states that he did, and he's like, well, I think he'll win. And he had a meltdown when, I think it was when Ohio was called at the time, when it was clear Romney no longer had a path to victory, and he went waddling off backstage to yell at the staffers and stuff like that, and they're like, oh, we're just telling you the numbers that are coming in. If you actually look, you can look at the graph here, link in the description to the RCP page with the Trump-Biden matchup. All you have to do is look at the actual physical graph here, and you can see the trend line long term, and there's really only about an extra point of deviation in this gap. And this is a short-term thing. Look, Trump's approval just took a hit in the wake of rioting. Because of poll lag, you're primarily seeing the initial fallout from the initial response, which was, for the first few nights, it was basically chaos. Since then, the National Guard has gone in. That's not really taken into consideration in these polls, number one. The coronavirus epidemic at this point is almost a non-issue. You've got Biden with his dumbass mask avatar on Twitter, but by and large, people aren't social distancing. People have forgotten all about it. That mysterious second wave never occurred. I'm beginning to think there might have been a little bit of a reason why the timing of these riots was chosen by the Bernie babies at this particular moment. And of course, Project Veritas shows us that some of his staffers openly proclaimed that if Bernie lost, they'd start burning U.S. cities. I think Minneapolis was one of those mentioned. Total coincidence, by the way. Conspiracy theory. Anyway, the actual gap here is not particularly any larger than it was. It was always like a 6-point gap anyway. This is 8 points. And it's stable. Trump has a long-term, very high floor. His level on here, his floor is at about 41%. Biden, meanwhile, he has a relatively high ceiling. Biden has been above 50 before. They're talking about, oh, well, Biden's above 50%. That almost never happens. Dude, look at the fucking graph. Half the time Biden's been above 50%. Except more recently. Trump started to do better. This is a temporary deviation from a long-term trend in which Biden has been steadily trending downwards for the entire year, and Trump has been roughly stable. Trump began to make up lost ground. I think that he'll do that again. But it's going to be kind of difficult for Trump to buoy himself up when you have a recession plus the epidemic plus riots going on. That holds a person down. The economy is beginning to alleviate, V-shaped recovery potentially in a big way. And of course, everyone, whether you're a liberal or a conservative or whatever you are, you should be hoping for the nation, by and large, to do well. I see the epidemic conditions being alleviated. At this point, we can say in places that have opened up, there's no significant uptick in cases. So I don't think there's going to be a massive pandemic going on come November. And again, in-party enthusiasm also plays a role. Biden has legendarily low amounts of enthusiasm among his supporters. he will probably go into the election with a few points lead over Trump in national polling. But if he's not aiming at the battleground states, number one, which seems to be the case, if the battleground states are deviating from the aggregate, and this is primarily related to blue state support where he's going to win anyway, and number two, Trump's in-party approval remains at above Ronald Reagan levels, it's going to be a wash. What'll end up happening, I think, over the coming month or so, is that Trump is going to make his case to the people, look, we've managed to get through all these crises. Do you really think the Democrats would have been better than I did? And I think that a lot of independent voters will agree with him on that token. I think that's, by the way forward. As long as the economy doesn't re-collapse back into recession or something, and it looks like we might be able to dig ourselves out before November, which is great. As long as, you don't have millions of dead corpses stacked like cordwood from a pandemic, Trump, by default, with the incumbent advantage and higher enthusiasm, I think manages to make it. Now, of course, this new deviation could form a trend. It could be that Trump ends up cratering like Bush did after Katrina. I'm just wondering whether Biden and the Democrats are in a position to really capitalize upon it. The only thing that could negatively affect him, I think, would be lowered enthusiasm among Republicans. Certain Republicans start thinking less kindly of him because they're like, well, he's not God Emperor. He didn't build enough of his wall. By and large, though, I think all of the Lego bricks are starting to fit together, and Trump is starting to form his little playset and earn his second term. Biden, meanwhile, is sitting there like thumbing his ass and eating the Legos. Biden, by and large, at the moment is an absentee except making tweets. Trump has already returned to campaigning. But anyway, when you're looking at polling, single polls don't matter. Look, there's an IBD poll here that shows Biden with only a 3-point lead. That's barely ahead of where Clinton was in November. By the way, she maintained a fairly considerable lead for most of the election. There was never a point, if I remember correctly, I don't think there was ever a point in the aggregate where Hillary Clinton was behind Trump in national polling in 2016. Now, of course, there was no incumbent there either. And Trump's enthusiasm was lower. The economy may be doing better despite the recession we've just briefly been in. The economy might actually be doing better than it was when Trump initially ran for office. Of course, there was no pandemic at the time. All of these things play a role. You can look at aggregates, though, and people say, well, Sticks, you know better than to trust the polls. Even in 2016, I paid attention to polls. It's just that I used aggregates and a little bit of common sense. When you begin cherry-picking your numbers, like, look, Trump is behind Biden. That's inarguable. The aggregated difference is too large to be made up for in terms of statistical noise or outliers. He is behind. What narrows that gap is that except for very recently he's been on an upswing, he has much higher enthusiasm, there's probably going to be a substantial turnout differential, and the things that have been dragging him down, the pandemic, the riots, and the economy, are all moving now in a positive trajectory. This, I believe, is a short-term deviation, probably a few weeks to a month, from a long-term trend that really brings Trump up to at least the magic 47. He doesn't need to be ahead of Biden in order to win the election. He was more than 2 points behind Hillary on Election Day. And of course, there was also a difference in polling. The aggregated polls were wrong too, in favor of Hillary Clinton at the time. Most of it was turnout. Hillary Clinton had really high turnout if you count California and New York. It's problematic. It doesn't matter if you get an extra million votes in California. You win by 1 vote or you win by 10 million votes in a state. It doesn't make any electoral difference. This is what Democrats don't seem to understand either, including polling aggregates, of course. That's about all. Peace out.